What I'd like to talk about for a few minutes here are wireless security models. This kind of focuses on if you've stuck with WEP and you've got to wait a while before you can actually get to WPA, WPA2. WPA2 is where you really should be going. WPA2 has both a personal and an enterprise model that we can use, and that if you're not using it and you have the capability to do it, that's where you should go. We'll take a look at those briefly. So the objectives of explaining the advantages of WPA, WPA2. I think we've all heard about WEP and the weaknesses of WEP, and WEP does have weaknesses. Some attempts, dynamic WEP, have been made to make it a little more secure, and actually did make it a little more secure, but it's still not going to be the encryption algorithm or the encryption protocol of preference in the wireless world. Technologies that are part of the personal security model, and we're going to have a personal model as well as an enterprise model. The transitional security model, transitioning from WEP to WPA2 preferably. And the enterprise security model. The enterprise security model is going to require us to have a radius server and an authentication server, Active Directory, something like that, in order to authenticate our users. Again, WEP does suffer from serious weaknesses. The repeating keys are one of the really big issues, and depending on how WEP is implemented by the manufacturer, it could be even weaker than some manufacturers can be weaker than others because of the number of times, the number of keys that are actually used, whether it starts with the same key every time, whether they're predictable, number of different things. And what we're really looking at is how long does it take to have a collision when we use the same key to encrypt two different pieces of data. 50,000 keys sounds like a lot, but you can go through those in a very short period of time. Band-aid solutions, attempts to make it a little bit stronger without actually changing the hardware, and that's one of the things that you get into at WPA and WPA2. You can't implement it on the existing hardware. You have to upgrade the access point, and you also need to upgrade the NICs so that you can use those protocols. So WEP2 and dynamic WEP were attempts to make it a little bit stronger. The better solution right now, best available solution right now, Wi-Fi protected access WPA and Wi-Fi protected access to WPA2, WPA2 again being the preference. 802.11i is the standard that's been around for a while, and these two actually make an attempt to implement that standard. Addresses the two weaknesses. And of course, here we only have the two weaknesses, authentication and encryption. I mean, what else do we do with these things other than authentication and encryption? So these are the two weaknesses of wireless networks, and they in fact are actually, there are other weaknesses of wireless networks. The ability to moderately easily do a denial of service attack. Microwave will do that, for instance. The ability to put a rogue access point into your network. Somebody decides that they really want to have wireless in their cubicle, in the break room, whatever else, they bring in their own access point, plug it into the network. You may or may not have the required security. You may or may not have just had a hole created in your network. Somebody plugs in a rogue access server dedicated to compromising your network, and its signal strength is stronger than one of the other access points with the same SSID. Well, the NICs in the workstations are going to be attracted to, connected to the access point with the strongest signal. So yes, these are really issues. WEP, and there's a number of different videos in YouTube how to crack WEP. You can crack it in a relatively short period of time. Busy access point, they talk about a couple hours. if you force the traffic, you're probably going to be able to do it 10, 15, 20 minutes. There are methods to do that. Take a look, search YouTube for crack WEP and also crack WPA. There's a number of articles out about how to crack WPA using our friends Backtrack and the Linux, the live Linux, Kali, the live Linux server, Kali being the replacement for Backtrack. Encryption, 802.11i replaces the RC4 stream cipher, and the stream cipher does one character at a time with a block cipher, and in this case we're going to use a 128K block in order to do that. So it manipulates an entire block of text at one time. It also uses the AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, which is currently the one that's approved by the NSA. And it is the strongest cipher that we're using right now. Designed to be, and that is secure, designed to be secure from attacks. They all obviously were at one point designed to be secure from attacks. This is, depending on the key length, chart of how long it takes to break AES. And we look here, we have a 40-bit key length, the number of possible keys, and I'm going to try to say that less than a minute. And then we go to the 56-bit, 30 minutes, 64 bits, 4 days, 80 bits, 800 years. Now this presumes that you have to go through all the different possibilities, 1.21 times 10 to the 24th possible keys. Until we get down to 256 bits, we have 1.16 times 10 to the 77th, which is 10 to the 56th years. Now if you use rainbow tables, once you have these hashes, if you have rainbow tables, it doesn't really take that long to crack that particular hash. But since we're going to be changing the keys on a regular basis, the crack's not going to really work for that long. When you use TKIP, it actually changes for every packet. 802.11i is authentication and key management by using the 802.1x standard. 802.1x uses port security. What we're really talking about here is using a radius server along with an authentication server in order to control access. It blocks traffic on a port-by-port basis if the protocol is implemented on the port. And this is a protocol that can be used for both wired and wireless. What you basically have is a port is turned off if we have a wired port, or the communication with the access point is turned off until we have the exchange of the packets for the authentication protocol. Once that happens, you can have other communication like getting an IP address and those sorts of things. Those are the EAP, the Extensible Authentication Protocol packets, are the only ones that are allowed through the port until authentication takes place. Makes it very secure. Also makes it to the point that you gotta have other stuff like the radius server, an authentication server, Active Directory or something like that in order to actually implement this thing. Key caching stores information from a device on the network, and this is for roaming. Roaming, again, we've talked about earlier, is the process of going from one access point to the other seamlessly so that you don't drop your connections. You actually continue to communicate. When the next access point becomes stronger, you will migrate, or your session will migrate to it. If your user roams and later returns, they don't want to re-enter the credentials, so the cache credentials are available from when you put them in the first time. This is a visual for the 802.11i. We have the laptop here, which goes to, and in this case the laptop going to be obviously want access to the access point. Communicates with the access point. The AP asks the device to verify its identity. Step 2. Step 3, the device sends the identity to the authentication server. We go here. The authentication server verifies the identity and then allows access. Tells the access point it's okay. A step-by-step process. A little visual there for that one. Pre-authentication allows a device to become authenticated to an AP before moving into the range of the AP, and what we're doing here is they actually will send the authentication information ahead. One access point we can actually do that. The device sends a pre-authentication packet to the AP the user is currently associated with, and the packet is then routed to the remote AP access point or multiple access points if you have more than one in the system. This allows faster roaming when we go from one access point to the other. Wi-Fi protected access, WPA, is a subset of the 802.11i, and here we have those two magic words, encryption and authentication, and that's what we're doing with these things. The Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, TKIP, the keys are known as per packet keys because they're going to change with each packet. TKIP dynamically generates a new key for each packet that's created, so that we are hopefully going to have a whole lot more keys than we had before. We're actually using hashes in this situation, and this is going to prevent collisions. And you remember, collisions is when we use the same key, repeat the key to on two different pieces of information, to encrypt two different pieces of information. When we do that using the XOR, we can then crack the key. The authentication server is used to produce a unique master key for that user session, and the master key, from the master key we derive other keys that we use on a per packet basis. The TKIP distributes the key to the wireless devices, and the AP sets up an automated key hierarchy and management system when we do these things. So we have this. WPA replaces the cyclical redundancy check with a message integrity check, the MIC, which allows us to prevent replay attacks, is really what we're talking about there. Strong mathematical function. And the clients are de-authenticated, and new associations are prevented for 1 minute if a MIC error occurs, and it is an optional feature. I want to try to do something here. Let me see if I can get to the browser and see some pictures of these things. We talked about the master key. We have the master key. From it we have a pairwise master key derived, and from the pairwise we have the transient key in order to be able to keep these things separate. And we talked about the MIC, kind of a process here. Actually, that's not it. The MIC is something that is optional in here that is going to prevent the system from, I'll get the right one in a second. It's going to help prevent replay attacks in the systems themselves. The Wi-Fi WPA, we have a CRC. The CRCs are different, you will notice here. The message integrity check would detect any changes in these things, and this is the CRC. You are fine and you are fired. The change in the message itself is going to change whatever goes on, whatever methodology that we use over here. We're going to have different numbers here, which tells the system, not a very good circle, huh? Tells the system that they are separate. WPA is accomplished by either 802.1x, and 802.1x is the one that uses the radius server and the authentication server, or a pre-shared key technology. The pre-shared key is the one that we're going to use for personal WPA, WPA2, and 802.1x is the one we're going to use in the enterprise itself. Pre-shared key uses a passphrase to generate the encryption key. It's got to be entered into each access point and into each of the wireless devices. Instead of using it as the encryption key, going back to WEP, it's just going to serve as the seed to generate the encryption keys. So it's not going to be the key itself, it's going to be the seed from which the encryption keys are generated. Designed to address WEP vulnerabilities with a minimum of inconvenience. We still can use the passphrase in order to do that, keeping in mind that the longer the passphrase, the better. Special characters are always going to help you out, those kinds of things. WPA2 is the second generation of WPA security and is based on the 802.11i. Uses AES as the data encryption standard. AES again is the one that is currently approved by the National Security Agency. Supports 802.1x authentication or pre-shared key technology, again just like WPA did, WPA2. Allows AES and TKIP, TKIP clients to operate in the same WLAN, wireless local area network. So we can have two different client types on the same network and it's still going to be functional. So here's a chart about the wireless security solutions. WEP, the encryption is going to be WEP. The authentication shared key, everybody gets the same key, security level. It's going to be low. WPA uses TKIP, temporal key. The temporal keys, temporal means temporary. Pre-shared key or 802.11i is what we're going to use for the authentication, medium security level. WPA2 802.11i uses AES as the algorithm and the authentication 802.1x, keeping in mind that WPA2 can also use a pre-shared key. The 802, the WPA2 with the 802.1x and AES is going to be the high security level. Models based on WPA, and we've said this earlier, we have personal and enterprise for each of these. The transitional security model used as a bridge, quote, bridge solution in situations where WPA or WPA2 is not available, haven't upgraded, can't upgrade, got too much equipment to buy, because again when we go from WEP to WPA, we've got to change the hardware that's used. The transitional stuff is intended as a temporary fix until you actually can get from one to the other. And getting from one to the other, we'll go back to TJX Corporation's compromise. This was one of the issues that they had, is they had not upgraded the access points from WEP. So we have an issue there. So the security models here, personal, again, we have pre-shared key, encryption is TKIP. Enterprise 802.1x, encryption TKIP. For WPA, WPA2, the upgrade to these things, pre-shared key and AES, 802.1x and AES. So in these, the WPA2, we have AES as the encryption algorithm, which is where we really want to get to. When you're configuring your access points, if you have WPA, WPA2 available, WPA2 is obviously the one that we want to use in these things. The transitional security models should only be a temporary solution, and what we're going to do is talk about a number of things that we said before really are not all that effective that we can do to try to make the network a little bit better. Shared key should be used instead of the open system. Remember, open system usually just connected. All you had to have for the open system to work was the correct SSID, and as long as we're broadcasting the SSID, we're going to have the correct SSID. Uses the WEP keys for authentication, and again, WEP not all that secure, but maybe better than nothing. It's based on the challenge and response scheme. The challenge is we send a challenge text and it gets encrypted with a web key, and that's the way we get authenticated. SSID, beaconing, the advertising of the name of the access point, the name of the network, the SSID, should be turned off. This may or may not actually cause some issues with Windows. I think the newer Windows clients have the ability to configure them to connect to the wireless even if it's not broadcasting. What SSID beaconing turned off does is prevents the casual observer from unauthorized attempts at the network, trying to enter the network. Use a hard to guess SSID and a WLAN. If we turn this thing off, don't make it simple like the school or whatever. That would be simple there. Keeping in mind that a dedicated hacker is going to be able to force some of the SSID and the packets at layer 2. And again, to get those packets, you're going to have to use a Linux system and put it into monitor mode, promiscuous mode, monitor mode, promiscuous mode for the wireless access points. MAC address filtering, managing a large number of these things can be a real issue. If it's not, you probably want to enable MAC address filtering, again keeping in mind that the MAC addresses are in the traffic that can be seen by somebody doing passive observation of the network. It doesn't provide an easy means to temporarily allow a guest user, but I think that many of, maybe even most of, the last one that I bought have the ability to, of course it had WPA2, but have the ability to open a guest network so that you don't actually have to allow the guests to have access. And you can configure it to either allow them to connect to machines on your network or not. MAC address can be spoofed or substituted. A number of different softwares to do that, and in Windows actually you can go in and type it into the properties of the NIC in many cases. DHCP restrictions: if you've got 15 machines that are allowed to access your network, you don't need to be able to provide 200 IP addresses. So you may want to limit the number of leases that are available to clients. That way there's a little bit of protection. Again, this is transitional, things that are not necessarily going to work, but every little bit helps. The objective of wireless security is to make your network secure enough that somebody else's is more attractive. Talked about it in classes before, but one of the ways to think about security is that two guys are out in the woods and they come upon a bear that starts chasing them, and one of them turns to the other one and says, "We got to outrun this bear." The second one turns to the first and says, "All I've got to do is outrun you. All you need to do is make your network more secure than the next guy's, so that he's the one that gets compromised or she's the one that gets compromised rather than you." Authentication: the starting and the ending IP addresses, maximum number of DHCP users, however many you have. If you have a limited number of clients, limit the number of IP addresses that you actually give out to the systems. And in this one we can put the DNS, the static DNSs in here. DNS, one of the things that I personally like and would recommend that you consider is Open DNS. It's free. There are lots of people working to protect you in this open source system from being diverted to one of these websites that are going to try to do nasty things to you. Maximum number of users in this one. Once you get to the maximum number of users, in this case we had 4, so we give out our 4 addresses to our valid users. And when this guy tries to get an address, he can't get it. The other thing to keep in mind is how long you're going to make these leases for. If you have them for a short time, he might be able to get one, and then one of your valid users might not be able to get it. A lot of different things to think about when you are trying to or working on security for your system. WEP should be turned on. That is, if no other options are available. Keeping in mind that sometimes people feel protected by WEP when they're really not protected by WEP. Don't get a warm and fuzzy feeling from having this protocol turned on. The longest WEP key should be used for the added security. Most of them have a 128-bit option, and that's the one that you should pick. Passphrase, and you should use a key instead of a passphrase. That's what this one's for. There's some evidence that the passphrase generators may create the predictable key, so instead of using a passphrase, if you're forced to WEP, you may want to just put in a key instead of the phrase. And keep in mind you can use 4 different keys, and you shouldn't have all the devices using the same key. The transitional security model, here we go. Authentication, shared key authentication, security levels low, disable SSID security. Each of these is going to be a low level of security. Perhaps when we put them all together, it becomes a little bit better with the system itself. The personal security model, single users, a small office, generally 10 or fewer wireless devices. That's just an arbitrary number. Intended for settings in which the authentication server is unavailable. We don't have Active Directory. We don't have a radius server. In these cases, we've got a doctor's office, a dentist's office, our home network is what we're really talking about here. And we have the 2 parts, WPA, WPA2. WPA2 again should always be used, and you can go back and look at the earlier chart. For one thing, we're going to have AES as our encryption protocol when we do that. PSK, pre-shared key authentication. Managing authentication server can be costly. In the world of virtual machines, maybe not as costly as it has been in the past. There are open radius servers that you can get, and you can have databases stored on the machine. That's just where are you going to get. Actually, you can probably use a database on the radius server itself, open radius, things like that. You don't have to use Microsoft Server implementation. You can go with if you have a server to run, you could go with one of the open source systems. Pre-shared key is used to authenticate the user, and it does play a role in encryption. Pre-shared key vulnerabilities, again, key management. If we have 3 people that know it, not a big deal. Once you get up to the 10, somebody's going to tell somebody else, and you're going to have more users more users than you thought on your network. Passphrases, again, there may be some vulnerabilities that were discussed in the previous slide. The security mode here, this is the encryption of one of the systems. WPA2 shared key, fairly long key, which it should be, and it should use a complex key. So we're going to do that. The WPA algorithms, this one is security mode WPA2 Personal. The algorithm we're going to use is TKIP plus AES. And we want to always go for the most secure of these algorithms. While we're here, let's bring up the packet tracer simulator again here and see if we can take a look at the Linksys again. When we look at it, I'll go setups where we're going to start out. Automatic DHCP, static IP. This is to get the address that we want. The IP addresses, if we go back to the wireless, we can specify what kind of network, whether we have a BG mixed, a G, a B, or an N. You really don't want a BG mix, because if that happens, if somebody happens to get on your network with a B as a B device, then you've turned your network into a B device. Wireless security, default here, and then I think that that's actually changed in most of them now, but the default used to be disabled, not a good thing. We could go to WEP. The key here, 64-bit. Remember, the 64-bit key with the 24-bit initial vector IV is going to actually wind up being a 40-bit key. The key 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can specify the transmit key. But what we were looking at is WPA2 Personal. In this we have AES or TKIP, whichever we want to pick for the encryption, and then we have the passphrase here. Key renewal 3600 seconds, and this is going to be changeable on your own. This is a simulator, and it's not one of the things that we can change on it. WPA2 Enterprise, we're going to have the radius server IP address and the radius port. The shared secret here is the shared secret between the access point and the radius server, so that they know that they're communicating with each other. And the key renewal here, 3600 seconds. And we have the choice of AES or TKIP. WPA2 Personal, AES or TKIP again, passphrase in this thing, and go back to WPA2 Enterprise. Again, we have the option of using our radius server in order to find an authentication server to authenticate users. And when you're using Enterprise, you're going to need certificates installed on the access points, which come from or are at least recognized by the authentication server. Because the first thing that happens is the device authenticates itself. Typically it's going to authenticate itself with a certificate, because back to what we had before, if you are plugging into a network, we have some controls. We know who's plugged into the network, or at least we hope we do. In wireless, anybody can connect to it. So in order to be sure that the correct people are going to be authenticating, the correct computers are going to be authenticating to the network, we issue certificates to those authorized machines. And once the machine gets authenticated, the user then can put in credentials that go to the authentication server and allow them to get onto the network. The other thing that we talked about a little bit, let's see if we can find it here in the setup. If we go down here, IP address range, the start address for DHCP. The DHCP server can be enabled or disabled. If you have DHCP reservations, this can actually help you out too. Reserved addresses takes a lot of work, but it can make your network a little more secure. And if you only give out reserved addresses, if I had the 4 previously that we talked about, I could put in the MAC address and the IP address one-to-one correlation. Again, if we do MAC spoofing, then we're still going to be able to get into it. But this would limit the number of MAC addresses and which number of IP addresses and which MAC address it actually went to. But notice the default maximum number of users is 50. If you have 4 users, you probably don't want this to be 50, because you open the door for other people to get onto your network. Let's go back to this. So we've looked at those slides. Pre-shared key, it's management key weaknesses. Again, it's the same with any of these things. With the pre-shared key, with the passphrase, any of it's going to have the weakness that you've got to get the key distributed, and therein lies a big part of the rub. Who's going to share that key with somebody else? People have a hard time keeping secrets. Pre-shared key only uses one key. Changing the pre-shared key is a real issue, because everybody that's got the key has now got to go in and change it on their device. To allow users to have access, the key's got to be given to the guest. Actually, you don't, because you can type it in for them, obviously, but that still becomes an issue. A 64-bit hexadecimal number can be used from this. And a hexadecimal number, remember that each digit in a hexadecimal number is half a byte. So we're talking about 64-bit hex number, or a 32-character passphrase, ASCII character passphrase. Pre-shared keys of fewer than 20 characters can be subject to offline dictionary attacks, and dictionary words are something that you really need to be aware of. If you look at a number of different attacks, dictionary attacks are pretty quick. The word has to be in the dictionary, and there are lots of dictionaries available on the internet that would allow you to crack these words relatively quickly. The good password cracking software uses a hybrid, and first it goes through and checks for the dictionary words, which are really fast, and after it finds the parts of the password that are dictionary words, then it goes and uses a brute force methodology in order to do the rest of them. Linksys, and I think most everybody now has a Secure Easy setup where they say, hey, okay, now that you've turned on your wireless access point, first of all, let's configure security. You really want to do that. TKIP, designed to fit into the existing WEP procedure. The wireless device has two keys, 128-bit encryption key called the temporal key, and a 64-bit MIC key, which is going to prevent replays. Temporal key is a temporary key, so it's going to change from point to point. So the temporal key is XORed with a MAC, get a value and a sequence number. Nice picture here. And what this shows is the parts of the WEP system that really aren't used. So we take away, see if I can get a pencil back here, can't not do this. All we have here is what's not used. The CRC, we use the MIC, which is something that's text with the MIC, and we do these things, we get the key stream just like we did the random number generator, pseudo random number generator value, the key sequence, the key stream XOR to the text in the MIC, and eventually we get to the ciphertext down here. What we don't have here is the initial vector, the IV, and the secret key aren't used anymore. We're going to use the temporal key in order to try to make this thing excuse me, more secure. Personal security, TKIP components, MIC, the IV sequencing, the initial vector sequencing, and the TKIP mixing. WPA2 Personal Security uses the keys that are automatically changed, and they call this rekeying, in authentication between the devices after a specified period of time. So rekey interval, so that we actually check by doing this rekeying to be sure that we're still connected to where we think we're connected. AES-CCMP is used in WPA2 for data encryption, is the encryption protocol. AES-CCMP is the standard for the 802.11i. Counter mode, CBC, MAC, CCM, a lot of different letters. What these do are make the system more secure. CCM provides data privacy, and the CBC MAC provides data integrity and authentication. Data integrity means that what I sent back to the earlier slide, you are fined versus you are fired. What changes, what is not allowed to change. And the AES, again, we're back to block, and it processes 128 blocks. The length of the key and the number of rounds can vary, but there are lots of rounds in this thing, so it encrypts the thing, encrypts the data a number of times before it actually sends out the ciphertext. If possible, you want all of these things to occur in hardware, because things that occur in hardware are going to be faster than things that occur in software. And if they occur in software, we're going to also detract from the processing capability of our system. We're back to another chart of what kind of authentication, what kind of security do we have. WPA2 Personal Authentication uses pre-shared key, low to medium, and low to medium dependent upon the length of the passphrase and the kind of characters that you use in the passphrase. Personal security with TKIP is a medium security level, and we go to WPA2 Personal. Again, personal security P-shared key is going to be medium, and then the encryption using AES CCMP is going to be a high level of security. The enterprise is the most robust, which also means it's probably the most expensive. Medium to large size organizations are used here. The settings which authentication server is available, Active Directory or NetWare NDS, the NetWare Directory services. Something that has a database of users with passwords that go along with it. Has two parts, WPA and WPA2. 802.1x authentication means that the hardware has to be authenticated before you actually get an IP address. Once you get an IP address, the user can then authenticate using a username and password to the authentication server. So we have the elements are the supplicant, the authenticator, and the authentication server. The supplicant is going to be what we historically have called the client, the desktop, the laptop that's going to go through there. The authenticator is going to be the wireless access point, and the authentication server is going to be our Active Directory or whatever other database that we're using. Software implements the 802.1x framework. It can be configured in Windows systems, may be included with a wireless NIC. Again, the 802.1x supplicant can be either a wired or a wireless. WPA2 Enterprise, the 802.1x, the supplicant requests access here 1 to 2, so we're going to request access. The request is forwarded to the authentication server. If access is denied, it comes back and it just says no, the process is done. If it says yes, then you go through the authenticating of the user. Authentication user, and we've talked about these things before. Use authorized users to verify their authenticity. Uses a radius server remote authentication dial-in service. Allows the company to maintain user profiles in a central database, our Active Directory or whatever else. Uses SQL and LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. This is actually what we're going to have with Active Directory. Active Directory at its heart is one of these things. Or in this case, they say Active Directory. If we just had an LDAP server, we could use it, or you can use an SQL server with these things. If you're using a Windows server for this, you can use the server basically to serve both functions. TKIP encryption is an interim for the WPA2. More robust is the ESCCMP, and that's where again we want to go. 802.1x authentication disadvantage is going to be cost. If you're already running Active Directory, the costs are not really going to be that much. And there's a number of softwares out there that will authenticate to the system rather than just using pre-shared keys and those sorts of things, where you try to get on the internet through the browser, and it diverts you to the gateway, and the gateway asks you to put in credentials, which then may go to different places, typically going to be your authentication server for the Enterprise Active Directory or whatever you're using for those. CCMP, AES CCMP is a 28-bit key length. Encryption includes 4 stages that make up 1 round each, and each round is iterated done 10 times. So we have 4 stages make up each round, so we have to make up 1 round in each round 10 times. So we're going to have an awful lot of encrypting that goes on in this system. These are the enterprise, and you notice we have mostly high. WPA2 Enterprise Security Authentication. 802.1x is going to be high. If we use TKIP for the encryption, it's going to be medium. If we use AES, CCMP, AES, the WPA2 Enterprise, then it's going to be a high, authentication, and a high encryption level. Robust secure networks use dynamic negotiations of authentication and algorithm between the access points, evolve as the vulnerabilities are exposed to these things. So the robust networks are what we really are using. Robust mean that we can modify, change, attack the weaknesses of the wireless itself. So with that, additional security solutions, and from this I think what you take away is if we have WEP, yep, we got to use it until we upgrade the hardware. Once we've upgraded the hardware, WPA, WPA2, depending upon whether you're using the personal or the enterprise, depends on how much additional hardware you may need, like a radius server and an authentication server. AES 802.1x uses port security. 802.1x can be used in a wired or a wireless situation. In a wireless situation, just like in a wired situation, we have the protocols are exchanging information until it actually determines that the device is valid. Once the device is valid, it then asks the user to authenticate. So we have a couple of different processes that hopefully are going to keep a number of people that shouldn't be on the network off of the network. TKIP, the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, and the MIC, the Message Integrity Check, are improvements, part of the 802.11i, that address both encryption and authenticity of the information. Transitional security model should be in fact transitional. You want to get onto one of the better models as quick as possible. WPA, WPA2, WPA2 again being the preference that we would want there. The personal security model for home or the small office, home office. Enterprise, larger size corporations or offices, one that's going to be running a server type, a database that can be used as an authentication server. Active Directory probably the most prevalent one that's available right now. With that, I want to thank you for listening, and I hope this has been useful. Thank you.